minutes. I just wanted to make that announcement. Good afternoon, everyone. Anriette Esterhuizen here. I'm currently chair of the MAG, and I will be the stand-in moderator for this session today, which is looking at one of the emerging and cross-cutting issue areas of IGF 2021. Just to place the session in context for everyone, this is one of the issue-focused sessions in the preparatory and engagement phase of IGF 2021. It will build onto and into and contribute to the Katowice Forum, the annual forum, which will take place from 6 to 10 December. And there'll be a main session during that forum, also focusing on inclusive internet governance and digital cooperation. And there'll be several workshops as well. The purpose of this preparatory and engagement phase is really to give us an opportunity, to give the MAG an opportunity and all the intersessional modalities of the IGF to delve a little bit below the surface, to initiate more deep interrogative discussion on these topics, and to scope them, to get a sense on what the concerns are and what the real questions are on the table. And in that sense, to try and contribute to the IGF having a more vertical, a more in-depth engagement with the issue areas on the agenda. So today's session is going to be in different segments. There'll be scene-setting remarks from a MAG member, Maria Pascales. I don't see if she's joined us already. She'll probably join us shortly. We'll then look at the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. That's a very key document that was published in 2020. And it has specific recommendations for the IGF, which the IGF MAG and others in the IGF community has been engaging in. And talking on that, we'll have past MAG member Ben Wallace, and we'll have Yu Ping Chang from the Envoy of Technology's Office, the UN Secretary General's Envoy for Technology. After that, we'll have interactive discussion, and please, I really encourage you all to put up your hands and to write in the chat. We want to make the session very interactive. We'll then look at advancing digital cooperation and what that really means, particularly when we're looking at digital cooperation connected with inclusive internet governance. And speaking on that, we'll have Shauna Shokru from Nexus Island, an activist and community media actor that's been involved in this process for a very, very long time. Following Sean will be Jyoti Pandey from the Internet Governance Project. And she'll talk particularly about developing countries and what multi-stakeholder cooperation means in terms of more inclusive internet governance. We'll also have Jovan Kurbalia speaking in that session. And Jovan is the head of the Diplo Foundation, and he was actively involved in the high-level panel on digital cooperation, which is the process initiated
Hi, everybody. I wonder if everyone has lost Anriette as I have. Okay, so hello.
Yes. Hi, Adam. It's Eleanor from the Secretariat. Yes, I'm trying to get her back on chat so she knows.
All right.
Apologies for this.
Adam Peake, MAG member. We are having a few issues with people and stomachs and technology and all kinds of wonderful things. So I'm a member of the MAG and have supported development of this session a little bit. Suki, of course, has taken the lead with Henriette and others. Where were we in the development of this program? I know that we've just mentioned Jyoti. And Jovan. So I think two more speakers just to cover here. So we were just saying how Jovan was involved in development of the roadmap, leading the high-level panel that developed that. So we'll talk through how we're going to advance digital cooperation in that section of this of the session. We lead on to the final part. And please keep your questions coming in the chat, as we mentioned, not about the moderation that's a little bit random at the moment, but about the subject matter will come up in a moment. So the role of the IGF in the future, and this is where are we going to take the IGF from now? How are we going to implement the roadmap? How are we going to think about some of the new developments, such as the common agenda documentation that's been released by the UN Secretary General's office recently, and other issues about really where are we taking the Internet Governance Forum and digital cooperation, following on from the work of the high-level panel and the roadmap. And for that, we have Fiona Alexander, and I think many of you have been involved in the IGF and all of the work around Internet governance will be very familiar with Fiona. She was the senior staff member at the Department of Commerce, US Department of Commerce, NTIA, where she really led all of the work coming out of the US government on internet governance, and particularly for the organization I work for, ICANN, was helping guiding us in developing issues for the domain name system. And so we're all very grateful for that. Checking it, and Paula Martins. Paula is working for APC. She's the lead on human rights policy, the advocacy lead for APC in this area, working particularly on freedom of expression and information topics. Paula has previously worked on human rights policy for the Human Rights Council, with the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, ITU, etc. And before joining APC was with Article 19, Human Rights Watch. So we have a very solid collection of speakers taking part. And with that, I think it's probably over to Maria Paz to begin with setting the scenes. And apologies for my unprepared introductions, but thanks very much. So over to you, Maria Paz. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for the kind invitation to setting the initial remarks and setting the scenes in this session. I am Maria Pascales. I'm representative of GRULAC in the MAG member in my third year. And the idea of my introduction today, it's a little bit to share with the audience that it's with us today, a general reflection about the discussion of the future of digital cooperation, where we are and where we're going. All the wonderful speakers that I already have introduced will deep dive in many of these topics, but the idea of my initial words is to give you a general sense of why we think that this is a topic that need to be one of the focus of the issues that will be concerned in this annual IGF. So the first thing to say, it may be the most obvious, as usually happen at the beginning, which is that we all realize the value of the internet in this moment in terms of how it contributes and many diverse aspects of everyone's lives. And in that sense, we also have achieved the realization that to really reach the full potential and value that internet and digital tools can provide for everyone around the world, we need cooperation. We need cooperation because internet, it's highly intertwined with every aspect of our social lives at the level of the local organization in terms of social, cultural, and economic growth and opportunities and of engagement with the private and public sector. But also we require cooperation because this is a reality at the more global level. Internet cannot resolve all the issues with one-dimensional perspective or approach, neither in terms of expertise, because of all these aspects that are intertwined, and neither also in terms of sovereignty. This is an interconnected network. I'm not saying anything that is new. And because of that, the strengthening of the internet in terms of the possibilities of freedom and expansion for the exercise of right, it will highly be dependent of the weakest point in which these considerations are regarded. So this provides us the imperative of requiring well-structured coordination, consolidation, and good governance at many levels, considering the technical aspect, the social aspect, the sociological aspect that have been also in evolution in the recent times. And this realization have become, with recent discussion about the role of and responsibilities of the different actors from the multi-stakeholder perspective that we have, for example, in the IGF, in which we look what can be the contribution from governments, from technical community, from civil society, from private companies in relating to these different issues, but also in terms of how each one of these actors can make contributions that are at the different layers in the aspect of infrastructure, but in the aspect of development of services, and how all these interact with the increasing evolution in the political realities that we see in the world, that translate in geopolitical tensions that not always are expressed, but they are there, and we need to deal with that also in the ensuring that internet become an open space and available for everyone around the world. And for all those purposes, we truly believe, as members of this MAG, multi-stakeholder advisor group of the IGF, that the IGF, it's particularly well placed to foster many of the dialogues that are necessary for advancing many of these discussions and questions. And this is a thing that is in the very inception of the concept of the existence of the Internet Governance Forum, but it's also something that had been stressed in the recent years, in which the focus on digital cooperation have moved, and now we can see it in many different forums, not only IGF, that it was naturally created for this, and still we believe that it has a unique position for contributing in this discussion and fostering spaces for dialogue. But also it's a reality that many other bodies at the UN structure, but also in other forums that not necessarily are part of the UN, many of these discussions have advanced. And we need to think about how those discussion need to have the feedback loop that comes from the discussion from the IGF for making more interconnected all this conversation. In general sense, as my colleagues will go deep in the next section of this session today, we can highlight as a very relevant moment the conversation that started a few years ago with the UN Secretary General high-level panel on digital cooperation. This panel was created in 2018-2019, and they worked in order to provide a roadmap in digital cooperation that could serve to the UN Secretary General to talk about many of these issues. And the result of this discussion was the report, The Age of Digital Interdependence, that was released in 2020. After that, the work was not stopped, because many of the questions that were posed in the roadmap for digital cooperation were precisely directed to how to address in a more effective way some of the issues that were identified in this report. And one of the main things that were highlighted there. It was the need of having an strengthened digital cooperation governance, and what will be the role of the IGF in this strengthened digital cooperation governance. We received, we welcomed in September of this year another document that was provided by the UN Secretary General that continue this line of work, building on top of what was already in the roadmap for digital cooperation, but expanded also to other dimensions that not necessarily related with the digital exclusively, but they are intrinsically intertwined with the digital because of the reason that I mentioned before, that at the end technology today is an enabler of every kind of human interaction. And this is our common agenda that has four broad headings. It refers to strengthening global governance, focusing on the future, and renewing the social contract with a focus on human rights, and finally ensuring that the United Nations is fit for this new era. In all this topic, we can see that digital cooperation is a kind of cross-cutting issue, because many of these things that are related with the future preparedness for health crisis, like the one that we are still currently living, or the fight against the climate change or inequality, or many other topics that are the center of this report, are all in some way cross-cutted by the issues related to how we can conceive the role of technology for helping and moving forward these issues, and also how we can prevent that technology can become an obstacle for realizing many of these objectives. For example, the one related with peace, in which there is an acknowledgement of also how technology can be a threat in many of these objectives. So I think that this is very relevant, particularly for the objective related with the renewed social contract that is proposed to be anchored in human rights, because many of these use of technology require this new perception about how technology relates with inequality, with the opportunity of everyone to benefit from progress, from wealth around the world. And in that sense, we know that internet and the digital technologies can be a great enabler, but also we know the reality, and it's something that is explored by other issues in this IGF, related how maybe some of these technologies need also to be rethinked or reshaped through conversations about regulation or other kind of different intervention from different toolkits and tool sets in order to really allow them to achieve this potential for really be at the service of the exercise of rights. So finally, for closing this initial remark, I want to stress the IGF as a widely distributed and inclusive platform for deliberating many of these issues, have been engaged during this all recent history that I am describing, particularly, for example, through the work of our working group in IGF strategy. I invite you to take a look in the website of this working group, in which you can see many of the proposals that have been done for continue advancing many of this discussion. And also, we as IGF, we look forward for engagement opportunities with this cooperation and the common agenda prepared by the UN Secretary General. We think that there is a fundamental need that the IGF is very much connected with policymakers, the ones that are making the decision related how to enhance the ability of the technology to realize this new social contract that the common agenda talks about. and we hope that this issue track that we are presenting today, it will be a place in which many of these things can be discussed and can be contributed, particularly to this, to be part of the raw material for continued discussion at the level of the decision makers and policymakers in the public and in the private side. Thank you very much. I will stop here and we'll go back to Adam for continuing with the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria Paz. Henriette here. So Adam and I are doing this together, and I'm stepping in here. So Maria Paz, thanks very much for that. And I think what really stands out for me very clearly in your remarks is that we need to recognize that the Internet Governance Forum, even though it's called the Internet Governance Forum, has in fact, since its inception 15 years ago, looked at digital governance more broadly. As the Internet has changed, so has the Internet Governance Forum. So now to look at digital cooperation and particularly at the roadmap, first, to get a perspective from the outside, from somebody in business who's very active in the space, Ben Wallace. As I said earlier, Ben works with Microsoft's UN Affairs team, but he's been a MAG member, so he's been very active in the IGF. Ben, what is your perspective on how the roadmap is perceived and how it relates to existing cooperation processes that have been established through the IGF, but also through other forums in the last few years? Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Henriette. And I'm struggling to share my screen, so the Secretariat is kindly going to help me with that. I've got 3 slides that I'm going to use to help me share my observations on the roadmap. And so that it starts with 2 general observations. And the first one relates to, they're reflected in the quotes on the right-hand side. So firstly, as per that second quote, it's about the power, the promise, and the peril of digital technologies. Microsoft believes that the digital transformation holds great promise, but also that the world has turned information technology into both a powerful tool and a formidable weapon. And so we felt that the roadmap struck a correct and a helpful balance in acknowledging both the benefits of digital technologies, but also providing a frank analysis of the challenges of their potential harms. And to take just 3 examples that were included in the roadmap, it shone a light on the many people who remain unconnected and excluded, on the use of the internet to disseminate child sexual abuse material, and on the cost of cybercrime and concerns around state-sponsored cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. And the other thing that Microsoft really welcomed was the roadmap's embrace of multi-stakeholderism, including the assertion that digital cooperation is a multi-stakeholder effort, and that the UN is ready to serve as a platform for multi-stakeholder policy dialogue. Multi-stakeholder models are now, I think, largely accepted as essential for informed policymaking in most intergovernmental organizations and by many national governments. But it goes beyond improving policymaking. Many of the most pressing global challenges, like bridging the digital divide, can only be solved with concerted and coordinated multi-stakeholder action. And the drafting of the roadmap itself was a multi-stakeholder process. Maria Paz mentioned the high-level panel on digital cooperation, and the roadmap was a response to that report. Well, the high-level panel was itself a multi-stakeholder panel that went around the world to seek the views of stakeholders. And then once the high-level panel had reported, the Secretary General's office formed multi-stakeholder working groups called roundtables to provide input on what the contents of the roadmap should be. And finally, for this slide, I think the roadmap has also provided a positive demonstration of trying to break down silos in policy making, because in these roundtables we see not just governments and stakeholders bringing their different perspectives, but we're also seeing different UN agencies coming together and working together to bring their various expertise to bear in a coordinated way. So turning to the next slide, and the implementation of the roadmap since its publication in June 2020. Yeah, and that second slide it's a screenshot, so forgive the quality of the image, but that's a screenshot from the Tech Envoy's office's website. And so I think we've seen some very good progress, but I think it's worth reflecting briefly on a few setbacks and initial concerns that some people had. Firstly, there was eager anticipation about the appointment of the Tech Envoy, and this has been unfortunately frustrated by the sensitive and ongoing investigation, which has seen the envoy placed on leave since January. In terms of the roadmap's implementation, I would describe it as uneven. Some of the roundtables have adopted implementation plans. They're working towards concrete outcomes, but a few of them have barely met since the adoption of the roadmap and don't seem to have any clear plans of action. In that first group, I'd say we're seeing some real progress in relation to connectivity, inclusion, capacity building, and digital public goods. And finally, I think there were some initial questions about visibility and transparency of the work. How was the roadmap being developed and then implemented? How easy was it to get involved in these roundtable working groups? And I think that there was maybe an initial effort to limit numbers to try and help the working groups be more effective. But I mention this issue partly to explain how it's been addressed. A lot of information is available on the Tech Envoy's website. The roundtable working groups are now open to anyone to join. And the slide shows a page of the website that contains details of the work to implement the roadmap. If you click on any of the squares, they take you through to information about that particular area of the roadmap, and where an implementation plan has been adopted, you can find those detailed implementation plans as well, and all the activities that they're planning to undertake. And at the bottom, the very bottom, you can click through to a list of the leaders and the members of each roundtable working group, so you can see exactly who's involved. And turning to the last slide, and there's a lot of words there, apologies for that. This is my own understanding of the progress that's been made towards the 7 measures that were outlined in paragraph 93 of the roadmap, which was the one that set out the Secretary General's proposals for how to strengthen the IGF. Now, I won't go through each one, but I want to touch on what I think are the biggest challenges and developments. The first is long-standing criticism from some quarters that the IGF is what some people might derisively call a mere talking shop. And actually, for me, that's one of the most valuable things about the IGF. The importance of the IGF physically bringing together people from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different parts of the world, and the new connections and the viewpoints that are then formed, that shouldn't be underestimated. This in itself is a meaningful outcome and an ongoing achievement of the IGF. But I recognize the desire for the IGF to do more, especially as digital technologies play an ever-increasing role in the way we live, the way we communicate, the way we consume, the way we exercise our civic and human rights. And I agree that the outputs of the IGF can be refined and developed to produce what the roadmap describes as more actionable outcomes under C there. There are already policy papers and non-binding recommendations that come from the best practice forums and from the dynamic coalitions. And I think it'll be really interesting to see this year how the new intersessional work, the policy networks on environment and meaningful access, which themselves are a response to paragraph 93E of the roadmap. It'll really be interesting to see how they further develop the catalogues of written outputs and the types of written outputs that are provided by the IGF community. However, I think a key factor in strengthening the IGF will be the ability to get these outcomes into the hands, into the inboxes of the appropriate decision makers. And that is indeed one of the envisaged functions of the multi-stakeholder high-level body that's mentioned in 93A at the top of the slide, which the Secretary General is expected to announce soon, I understand. And indeed, I believe it needs to be its primary function to serve as a bridge between the IGF and decision-making bodies, and to raise the visibility of the IGF and make sure its various outputs are seen and can be taken into account. And the last thing I'd say is, I look with interest at what the common agenda might mean for the IGF, which I know that others are going to come to later in the session. In the roadmap, the Secretary General writes that he supports these measures to enhance the forum and intends to implement them as appropriate. And what I note in the common agenda is what you could see as arguably stronger diplomatic languages. He urges the IGF to adapt, innovate, and reform. And we all need to be conscious that the IGF's mandate is up for renewal in 2025. And I think the work that's going to be done in the next 2 or 3 years to strengthen the IGF, work that's going to be done variously by the UN, by the Secretariat, by the MAG, and by the community as a whole, that work is going to play a big role in whether there is still an IGF come 2026. Thank you, Henriette. That's what I was going to say. I don't know if there are any questions.
Thanks very much, Ben. Let's hear from Yuping, and then we'll open for a Q&A. And Yuping Chan is a senior program officer currently in the office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. But she has been with this process from the HLPDC to now the Common Agenda. So I cannot think of a better person to give us a perspective from the inside and how the roadmap evolved from the high-level panels report, how it connects to the Common Agenda, and what the victories have been and what the challenges are. So Yuping, please, I'm very happy to have you. You have the floor.
Unmute your mic, please.
Yuping, you are unmuted, but we can't hear you. I'm just checking if there is. Can you hear us? Just let us know in the chat. I think she has just dropped off and will probably join us in a minute. I'm just going to give her a few seconds. She's back. Yuping, we can't hear you. I can see you are in the participants list. Okay, try and unmute yourself. I still cannot hear you. Good, we can see you. Can't hear you yet, but almost. Look at your mic levels in your sound settings with Zoom. It sometimes you just need to go and increase your level, because you are, I can see that you are not muted. Still can't hear you. While Yuping is trying to get her audio sorted out, I have a question which she can respond to, and Ben too, but we can also just move on to Sean. My question is really, in the high-level panel report, the idea of the IGF Plus, of an expanded IGF was presented as one of the models to make up the architecture, or to be the core component of the architecture of digital cooperation. So it was envisaged in the high-level panel's report, not just as a forum to talk about internet-related matters, but actually as a forum for engagement in digital cooperation and digital policy more broadly. But that conversation seems to be, it seems to have shifted away. And so I'm quite curious if that vision is still there. And when we hear in the digital cooperation, in the roadmap, suggestions to strengthen the IGF in the common agenda as well, is that still with that bigger picture vision that was outlined in the high-level panel's report in mind? That's just a question. It would be helpful, Ben, if you can reflect on that, and Yuping, you too, when you are able to speak. But Ben, do you have a response to that question in the meantime?
Yes, thanks, Sandra. And I wondered about mentioning that as well. I didn't want to go beyond my my allotted time, and so I didn't go into the details of those other two options. And I think the fact that I can't recall their descriptions, how they're described immediately, is a sign that I, along with a lot of the multi-stakeholder community, had really focused on the idea of an IGF plus, even though the panel presented these three options. I think it's true that I think there was this sense among a lot of respondents to the high-level panel and contributors to the roadmap that the IGF would already existed, and makes more sense to build on something that's already there. I do note that the roadmap did say discussions are ongoing on the different architectural models. The other two are ongoing amongst stakeholders, it said, and it did. I think it mentioned the possibility of some kind of member states-led working group exploring one of these approaches. And I'm going to read it out here because I've just found it. Member states are considering working with a multi-stakeholder task force to pilot the distributed co-governance model at the national or regional levels. But I haven't followed where that got to. And as you say, the common agenda talks about the IGF, but I don't think it makes references to those other two models that were discussed in the roadmap in the high-level panel. So that might be a sign that things really have just settled now on how to make the IGF a success, so that it can serve the purpose of supporting digital cooperation.
Thanks, Ben. Yuping, I see you are back with us. Are you able to speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Welcome.
And
please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you again, colleagues. I apologize for that technical difficulty. I meant to give a little bit of a background and history, but I think Ben and Maria actually covered most of the origins of how this process started. I also wanted to say that Ariad is too kind. I actually have not been with this process as long as many of you have. I actually only joined this work sort of early of last year. So the history and the origins of a lot of the issues that you've been discussing have really been grappled with very in-depthly by a lot of you, Jovan and Ben, all of you that have been engaged for such a long time. It's really been very useful to hear your perspectives, especially as it's been a shared journey in many ways and an evolution of the approaches on a lot of these issues. In terms of the challenges and opportunities and so forth, it's been very interesting sort of hearing Ben's perspective on the roadmap from an outsider, and then to sort of complement that with what we see from the inside. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I see as the challenges going forward and what we're focused on right now from the Office of the Tech Envoy in terms of implementing the roadmap. I think Ben is right when he says that the pace of implementation of the roundtables appears to have been a little bit inconsistent. I will be frank and say that it's also because some of the areas of work in the other roundtables where it's not so visible is a little bit more sensitive. And as such, some of the work is not really ready for public publication or sort of sharing more publicly. So for instance, I will be very candid in saying that the Digital Trust and Security Roundtable, some of you would know that that has been traditionally one of the more difficult discussions, even from the time of the high-level panel. And in its evolution last year, it took a little bit of work on the part of the Secretariat and the co-champions to get it to where it is. And so, for instance, I will share again that the co-champions feel that a little bit more discussion internally has to go on before really it's fit for a little bit more of the public efforts that some of the other roundtables are working on. The Digital Trust and Security Roundtable, for instance, just met yesterday with its constituents and has agreed on some areas of work to continue going forward. And it is in light of the fact that they recognize that this has been a little bit more of a difficult area of discussion and collaboration since the time of the high-level panel. So that's been the reason why I think there's a lot of information on certain parts of the roadmap, because those are really the areas where there is consensus, understanding, and really an impetus to move forward. But some of the other areas need a little bit more of work behind the scenes, working with multi-stakeholder actors, convening sort of different actions so that the environment can be ready for the roadmap's actual recommendations to take fruit. So again, going back to the example of the Digital Trust and Security, colleagues would be aware that many of the stakeholders around the table actually had put forward letters to the President of the General Assembly, the United Nations, statements on the issue of internet fragmentation, which is connected to this question of trust and security, open, free, and secure internet. So that is part of not the official work of the roundtable, but really this sort of coming together of like-minded people acting in different areas to help us move towards the objective, not specifically in terms of implementing the roadmap per se and the line-by-line words on the paper, but sort of moving us towards where we want to be and the vision of the roadmap as manifested elsewhere. So that's sort of an explanation to say why it might appear that it is uneven, but please rest assured that there is work behind the scenes on some of these areas as well. And like I said, and I really also do appreciate Ben's note that we've been trying to be a little bit more open and transparent in how the work has been going on. And I really do ask that if anybody is interested, please reach out to our office at any time. We'll be happy to plug you into these discussions and also sort of update you on where we are and let you know that really there is that type of work that is going behind the scenes in terms of pushing forward the roadmap's vision. In terms of the areas that I wanted to speak about today, in challenges and opportunities and where we are right now, one key area, as has been flagged by Maria and Ben, is this issue of implementation, how far we've been pushing. So as Ben has really explained, there really have been roundtables which are pushing forward very concrete objectives and will be publishing work very soon. So for instance, the International Telecommunications Union, through a multi-stakeholder framework, has developed a baseline for connectivity, which will be, I think, issued shortly. They're having a roundtable next week, for instance, to go over the draft and to take suggestions. They're also looking at certain areas of work when it comes to emergency connectivity and so forth. So those roundtables will be publishing key documents and key outcomes of the multi-stakeholder work shortly, and we expect that to be actually a technical backbone of the work towards the Global Digital Compact, which I think I will go into a little bit later because I assume there will be questions on that as well. I will also say that another area where I think the roadmap has been really helpful, and I think both Maria and Ben alluded to this, is the coming together of the UN system in a way that was not as coordinated before. I mean, there are over 40-something UN agencies that work on some area of digital. There are big ones, there are little ones, there are many looking at this issue from all different perspectives. And it was the roadmap that allowed the Secretary General to put an overall framework of what the entire system is doing and saying that we should all really try and prioritize certain areas and put all our disparate efforts, initiatives, programs within this broader framework of the roadmap for digital cooperation. So that has been very helpful in giving my office a lever with which to say, you know, UN agencies, we have to speak with one voice. We have to focus on delivery. We can't be just chasing up all these various little areas instead of really seeing how it fits into the perspective and finding ways to collaborate with each other and not duplicating what the rest of us are doing. And also in so doing, partner with the necessary private sector companies, NGOs, to really realize that kind of work as opposed to just going it alone. So that sort of pulling together of the UN agencies has really been very helpful. And that's why you see, for instance, the ITU, the UNTP, really in lockstep together with my office around the vision of connectivity, around the idea of more coordinated digital capacity building around the world, and working with partners to really sort of envisage this program in a way that is more coordinated and more cohesive from the UN side. And what has also been a focus of my office and something that we really will try and strengthen the work on in the next few years is this idea that it needs to deliver in country on the ground. So it's not just about discussions that happen at an extract level. It's about programs that have real impact on people's lives and communities. And so, for instance, we've been working with what we call the Development Coordination Office here at the UN that focuses on the UN's resident coordinator system and our country teams, which comprise the various UN agencies working in a coordinated fashion in individual countries, developing countries, mostly about 140 around the world, to deliver UN technical assistance and capacity building in a more coordinated fashion. So we've been working with the various UN agencies, headquarters, ITU, UNDP, UNICEF, as part of that overall coordination structure so that we can deliver roadmap implementation and these areas of digital capacity building, digital transformation, and the UN's efforts directly through the UN's country presence in the ground, and thereby make the most impact. And so my hope is that that area of work will really continue to grow. We've been also fostering more member state support for this idea that it really is delivery on the ground through the UN system, working with our various partners that matter. I've also been in very initial discussions with some of the private sector companies to think about what areas of capacity building and support they can also offer to countries on the ground, national governments that come to the UN and say, we need support when it comes to digital transformation. We need understanding of what it means to build a digital capacity. How can you as the UN support us? So that area of implementation, I think, will be key going forward. The other thing I want to talk about, I think it was alluded to, and I believe it will come out because this is the focus of the IGF, the multi-stakeholder model. Ben said that multi-stakeholderism has been accepted as the form of decision-making around the world. I'm not sure that this is that true here at the United Nations. And I think that in some ways, our office, the whole process that has led from the high-level panel to the roadmap and now the common agenda has been an experiment of sorts. And it remains to be validated in some sense here at the United Nations. And so our commitment as an office to this multi-stakeholder model, the IGF's commitment to the multi-stakeholder model is not something that we take for granted here, particularly in the UN community. I'll give you the example, for instance, of the fact that when it comes to the discussions around cybercrime here in New York, I think some of the civil society stakeholders around the table will know that it was not ultimately envisaged and decided as a multi-stakeholder process. And there have been actually strong obstacles that have been put up by countries who actually might be perhaps more, you would assume, more supportive of multi-stakeholderism to multi-stakeholder engagement in the cybercrime process at the UN. So I don't know that we can take this kind of approach, inclusivity, transparency, and multi-stakeholderism for granted here at the UN. And in fact, if anything, this is where I do think a lot of the activism and energy has to be targeted, emphasizing that this is fundamentally important in the area of digital, and that in some ways this can be a role model for cooperation across the UN more broadly. It is something that we've been trying hard to push. I'm not convinced that it will be that easy. And very frankly, with the common agenda, the discussions around the common agenda, there already is this kind of question that has been raised here in the New York community, the extent to which the Secretariat has the discretion to do certain things, by extension, the question by which, how much of this should be member state driven, but how much of it should be other stakeholders as well. There here, I think, is a particular area in which the IGF can help address, because a lot of the concerns that have been raised around multi-stakeholderism, the publicly voiced ones at least, is this concern that multi-stakeholderism is dominated by civil society and stakeholders from Western developed countries versus allowing an opportunity for developing countries to actually use their multi-stakeholder community to also have an added voice. So the problem here, I think, is that some have said that multi-stakeholderism is dominated by the rich, the developed countries, the global north. And hence, it's a way of sort of compounding the advantage that perhaps some sectors already have by sort of introducing multi-stakeholderism as opposed to multi-stakeholderism being equal for everyone. So I think this is an area where perhaps there is scope for the IGF to really address this concern and really say that multi-stakeholderism is really for all communities versus a certain privileged group of countries or perspectives or interests. And so that's where I do think—
You're being sorry, are you nearly finished? Sorry, we're running out of time.
Sorry, I'm running out of time. The last thing I want to say very quickly is that I think it was mentioned by Maria, this question of geopolitical realities. We at the UN confront this a lot. And so that's why we've consciously steered the roadmap's implementation into areas where we do think there can be greater understanding and consensus, capacity building, inclusion, connectivity. So that does also explain a little bit of a focus in the area, but we do think that going that way allows us to use that to make progress elsewhere, because it is in establishing connectivity that we address issues of building a safe environment for people to be connected online, which protects their rights and privacies as well. So I'm happy to discuss that a little bit further, but just to say that this notion of geopolitical realities is also why it's shaped the approach that we've taken in many ways as well.
Thanks very much, Yuping. Everyone, we're running out of time. So we're a little bit late. We've only got 40 minutes left. But I want to open the floor. Are there any questions for Ben or Yuping on the background and the perspectives they shared on the digital cooperation roadmap and its implementation? I'm just looking to see if there are any hands.
Yeah,
Adam, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm here, sort of trying to jump in as a.
Just introduce yourself. You've introduced yourself, but everyone else, please just introduce yourself when you first take the mic.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Adam Peake, and I'm a MAG member and trying to help you out a little bit with the moderation, but you're doing much better job than I could ever do. So that we'll keep with you, I think. But I do have a question really for you, Ping. We, of course, in the MAG and the community, we're talking a lot about how the IGF will evolve. There's been a lot of response to the roadmap recommendations, and certainly improvement is happening. We're seeing this with the preparatory sessions that are happening now, and a lot of other work that's ongoing, the mapping exercises and so on. So I'm just wondering, is the IGF the space for cooperation that you're envisaging going forward? Or are you considering the possibility of alternative spaces in the longer term? Is the IGF the mechanism to take cooperation forward? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Adam. I just want to check if there's another hand before I ask Yuping and Ben to respond. I don't see a hand, but there are a few questions in the chat. There's a comment about transparency and that the strength of the IGF has been its transparency. And maybe that also creates certain limitations, reflecting on what Yuping was saying about cyber security. And then there's a question, how do newcomers get involved in the roadmap? So back to you to respond to these questions, please. Yuping, do you want to go first, particularly to respond to Adam's question?
Thank you, Henriette. Adam, I think we see the IGF not necessarily as the forum, but a key forum, because I think it's a reality, sad to say, that there are other convenings around the world that are happening in the area of digital. And so that's part of the question of how does the IGF up its game to engage with these other processes and forums as well, such that it really becomes one of these areas. From the UN's perspective, it should be the key forum, but that's not the reality that exists. Truthfully, as we look at sort of the landscape of digital discussions and convenings right now. So I think what we need to do is, as introduced in the roadmap and reaffirmed in the common agenda, we have to find a way to strengthen the IGF's role. When it comes to sort of this consultations phase, I do think that the IGF's inputs are fundamentally critical. And that's why I do look to the IGF's multi-stakeholder nature to really produce these elements that we would need for the Global Digital Compact. That in these areas that the Global Digital Compact has flagged as key elements, universal connectivity, protect human rights online, perhaps new areas such as protect data, the contribution of the IGF community will be critical in sort of saying, this is what we fundamentally feel, having been in this space for the last 15 or 20 years, that this is what is needed for the next step in digital cooperation and for some form of consensus understanding by governments, civil society, private sector companies.
Thanks, Yuping. And I'm afraid we do have to move on now. And I think maybe the next segment will also build on this conversation that Adam just started and that Yuping contributed to. And this is really to look at what it means to advance global digital cooperation, and is it getting us closer to inclusion and more inclusive governance, more accountable governance is another question. But Shauna Chokru, can we start with you? And what is your perspective? You were involved at the WSIS and you were very active in drafting the Communications Rights, Information Rights Society's campaign, and in fact the civil society statement around WSIS, which touches on all these issues that we're talking about now. What's your view?
Thanks, Henriette. Yeah, I do want to address how to advance digital cooperation in a general sense in the direction of inclusion. I'll just share my screen there, if that's okay. You can see the screen?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, very good, thanks. I'm going to sketch a quick stakeholder analysis of digital cooperation globally on 3 dimensions. First, the dimension of power, which is economic and political. The second, in the dimension of motivation in terms of what stakeholder groups are trying to achieve. And the third is around the capacity and skills, or the abilities and tools that they bring to bear to it, each of the groups. Now, I have a very simple assumption that I hope most of you agree with, and that is to achieve inclusion. Those who have experienced and continue to experience exclusion must be engaged as a central actor in the process. So that's a kind of background assumption. I'm going to dive straight in by looking at the different stakeholder groups, beginning with the digital corporate world, or the digital corporations. I think whether everybody agrees or not, I would regard them certainly as the most powerful of the players in these arenas. And this derives from their enormous economic power that developed exponentially in what was in effect a void of political power, or if you like, of governance structures in that area, and the rise of neoliberalism at the same time. And this has put them firmly in the driver's seat since. And we can see that actually in the forms that multi-stakeholderism, despite what Yu Ping might have said, that have actually emerged in practice. But where is it heading, or what is their motivation? We know, of course, that maximizing profits is, if you like, an obligation of corporations for shareholders. And I expect no less and no more from them. And I haven't been disappointed. It's in their DNA. But it is a very, very abstract goal. And it is no content in terms of human needs or ethics. And note, of course, that it can never be fully achieved. The need to expand profits can never be satisfied. It's always there, and it always grows. With regard to capacities, well, I think they have all the capacities that money can buy, which is an awful lot. But the problem is they're harnessed more or less towards one end, and that limits their scope. Specifically, one that money can't buy is the capacity to understand exclusion. And this was my starting point. The empowerment of those excluded is the only route towards inclusion. So I'll move on to the second stakeholder group. Sorry for the rushing, but I really want to keep time for others as well. Governments. Well, moving to governments, a few trends are evident in terms of political power. There's been a lot of talk about polarizing around the 2 major powers. There's been talk of a digital Cold War, and the Tony Blair Foundation coming up with the idea and proposing the idea of a digital NATO. Much more important, I think, from the point of view of what I'm talking about here, is the North-South axis. And here, the power of the global South depends on their level of cooperation and collective action, as distinct from their level of economic power or political clout. Their level of cooperation and collective action, which unfortunately has actually declined over the last couple of years in general, for instance, around issues such as trade. The motivation of all governments is to some extent compromised. Even the most powerful governments are compromised very often in relation to the major corporations that they house or believe they house. Governments in the South do see the danger of being dominated by northern digital corporations, but the smaller ones are also very worried, and rightly so, about being left out entirely. And this makes it difficult for them. Although, of course, everywhere, governments are very often run by self-serving elites, and the South is no different from that. But the southern countries do understand exclusion, and at some level, there is a basic motivation to tackle exclusion at the global level and even within their own countries. But in capacities, it's only actually the largest southern governments that have the resources to understand and to engage and participate effectively at the global level. I'll move on to the UN system very quickly, which of course is ultimately an expression of member states, but it also has a degree of autonomous political power through setting agendas and providing leadership. Its motivations vary, but the founding principles of the UN at least offer the basics of an ethical and human rights orientation. And in capacities, the different specialized agencies also differ in very important ways. Some of them are highly technical, such as the ITU, which has been mentioned a few times. However, it is limited in the extent to which you can address the type of exclusion that we're talking about. Despite the BDT and so on, there are limitations there. And then you have the more general UN organizations who do in relation to this issue, such as UNESCO, or human rights organizations, which which I think actually bring a horizontal kind of issues to bear on this and are highly relevant when it comes to exclusion. So civil societies. First of all, they're a mixed bunch. Some explicitly or implicitly pursue the agendas of other stakeholders, such as the private sectors, but most can, with some legitimacy, claim to be motivated by a wider public interest and to draw on the principle of human rights and sometimes of social justice. But there are two broad types here in this context. One is those who have been concerned for a long time with the digital domain and governance issues. They've been active since even before the WSIS in these issues, in the governance fora. But the other are involved in, the other group of CSOs involved in substantive sectors like agriculture, trade, economics, education, health, human rights, community empowerment. And these are the ones that are much more likely to represent and be composed of the most marginalized. Now, the power of the CSO sectors to analyze that is based on their capacities and their legitimacy. First of all, the capacity to understand and to engage with the issues. And secondly, their legitimacy to mobilize and engage in actions on the ground and at fora at different levels. And this in turn relates to their capacity to influence government. So power is derived from legitimacy, which of course means about transparency, democracy, and so on, and capacity. But a key difference between the two groups of CSOs is, of course, that those that have been involved for a long time are very well organized in these forums and do understand the issues, but they do not understand the issues of the issue-based group of CSO. And the issue-based groups of CSOs involved in trade and health and media and so on, they generally have little understanding of the details and the dynamics of how the internet and the digital world, AI and so on, is influencing and completely transforming what they do. They are aware that it's happening, but they don't understand the dynamics and they don't have the capacities to actually get involved in these kind of arenas. So you do have a split among CSOs, and that weakens what I think is the legitimate stakeholder in this, in the digital revolution, and that is the combined bar of legitimate CSOs. Very briefly now, you can map anything you like there. You have internet digital governance in the middle. These are arrows. You can fill them in any way that you like. And I think it actually is a useful exercise to map out the influences that each group has on the other and mutually how they support and how they get in each other's way. But I'm far more interested in those that can, I believe, ensure that there is a more inclusive process going on. And these are the issue-based CSOs on the bottom right there, where they do genuinely represent the organizations and are made up of organizations in the South and marginalized group. And then you have the least developed countries, which I agree with Yuping entirely, are underrepresented in the situation. And then in the bottom left, I think the general UN agencies that I mentioned, such as UNESCO, it's a real shame that they've been slipping down in terms of visibilities. They haven't been mentioned at all. I work with them quite a lot, and they have a lot to say and would have a lot more to say on this issue, but also others involved in kind of human rights and development, core development and trade issues. And then you have the UN regional commissions. And I mean, I won't talk about, for want of time, about these arrows which represent different relationships, but I will move on to the last slide, which is just to mention a couple of concrete things that I think could be done. And these could be done actually in any context, whether it's the IGF or the Global Digital Compact or the Summit of the Future, or for that matter, the WSIS plus 20, which hasn't really been mentioned and is due in 2025. And I think really shouldn't be sidelined. It's could be a very, very important event. First of all, I think the internet governance CSOs and the issue-based CSOs have to come together to enrich their knowledge and to develop common strategies. It's happening, and the JustNet coalition that I'm involved in is doing it to some extent, but it really has to happen an awful lot more, with the goal of enabling the issue-based CSOs to engage a lot more strongly in the process in order to put forward the positions of the groups that they're representing and they're working with, which is across all sectors. And we have to remember that the internet and AI and all of this is really transforming all of these sectors. So if there's any donors out there, I didn't see any names, but yeah, take note of that. It's an area that really needs development. The second, I think, is the UN regional commissions and relevant agencies to strengthen. I think they have a strong role in strengthening cooperation and capacities to enable least developed country participation. I'm very glad to see that the IGF next year is going to be run by the UNEC in Addis Ababa. But I've worked myself, and I know they have been to some extent involved with UNESCAP in Asia and the Pacific. And just to note that they, for instance, have a center that's called the Asia Pacific Center for ICTs that I evaluated myself. And one of the recommendations and one of the things they want to do is to be able to advise the countries in the region. So I think the role of the UN regional commissions, as they do in the context, for instance, of the SDGs, should be strengthened to bring together those countries to develop common positions, to build their capacity, and to strengthen cooperation between them. Finally, I think it is worthwhile that the UN agencies, as I've said a few times, the horizontal ones that are involved in human rights, freedom of expression, and in development of trade and so on, should be offered and should be pushing to take a more prominent role in the fora that are there. That's it. Thanks very much. I hope I didn't run over time.
I think you did, but I think everyone did. So I'm giving everyone a little warning bell that we might have to stay on a little bit later. But we did lose some time due to tech issues. Thanks very much for that, Sean. And I think you really build on Yuping, highlighted the tensions around a multi-stakeholder that remains in the UN system. And I think what you've done is unpack that and actually point to the core of those tensions, which is about power and unequal and shifting configurations of power. And I think that's very important. I think we tend to think in binaries between multilateral versus multi-stakeholder. But in fact, that is not, in my view, really a helpful way. We need to unpack power dynamics in more specific and more targeted ways, and they can cut through and across multi-stakeholder and multilateral. But Jyoti, let me hand over to you and let's hear your perspective from your research work and also having worked both within India and globally on inclusive accountable governance.
Thank you, Henriette, and thank you for the invitation. It is an honor to be a part of this discussion. I begin by commending the MAG members, the IGF Secretariat, and the various teams who have been working silently behind the scenes for a successful IGF. I will try to be very brief in my remarks given the paucity of time. And I also begin with the caveat that I have not been working as long or been as involved as others on this discussion. So this is a bit of an outsider perspective. As I'm based in India, my remarks are informed by my experiences, but not representative of developing nations. I begin with a focus on trends in internet governance with the aim of highlighting why cooperation is needed now more than ever. As the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation rightly recognizes, the world is at a critical inflection point for technology governance, made more urgent by the ongoing pandemic. During the pandemic, consumers have moved dramatically towards online, pushing the adoption of digital technologies by several years. But there have been challenges too. Technologists struggle to ensure the internet is able to keep pace with the rapidly growing number of users. Restrictions on internet freedoms are increasing globally. Governments have expanded their capacity to monitor populations, control the private lives of citizens, censor access, and shut down the internet entirely. People are concerned about the privacy and security in the face of government surveillance, commercial use of personal data, and cybercrimes. As the internet's importance grows, some governments are pushing for increased national control and a greater voice in the governance of the internet, both its infrastructure and its use. States have resurrected expansive framings of sovereignty in internet governance forums and policy spaces, and geopolitical competition is leading to regulatory and technical fragmentation. The outcome of the current era of geopolitically driven internet governance is not clear at all. But whatever the result, it is certainly going to affect a broad range of entangled economic, technical, regulatory, political, and social interests. There are many important topics and recommendations that are included in the UN Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Report that deserve consideration and careful review. I will focus on a few issues identified in the report that are especially relevant from an emerging economy perspective. The first is, of course, universal connectivity. With over half the world's population still remaining unconnected from the global internet, the pandemic has also brought into sharp focus the need for cooperation to improve connectivity. The UN agreeing to convene a global group of investors and financing experts for investment in connectivity is a positive and much needed initiative. Apart from reducing the digital divide and supporting the beneficial users of technologies, we must, as the roadmap recognizes, focus on meaningful connectivity, that is adequate data, speed, and devices for all, not just those who can afford to be connected. Secondly, on digital public goods, the roadmaps focus on promoting open source software, open AI models, open standards for data, and open content. It's important because it promotes the value of openness on which the internet is built and recognizes the importance of common open standards in the achievement of the SDGs. Under digital inclusion efforts, the roadmap notes that we must focus on the inclusion of everyone, especially women, younger people, but most critically from developing countries' perspective, the most vulnerable groups like migrants, refugees, and internally displaced people. Particularly under digital human rights, there are certain issues that are going to be of relevance as we move forward. The roadmap recognizes that personal data collection-based business models, which are in the news cycle every day, surveillance technologies like facial recognition technologies that need to be limited. Particularly under digital identity, the roadmap critically recognizes multiple forms of identity, a growing area of research and concern in developing countries. For data protection, the roadmap calls for human rights-based data protection regimes that include access to judicial review. Member states are required to place human rights at the center of regulatory frameworks and legislation on the development and use of digital technologies. The roadmap also correctly recognizes the space for anonymity and touches upon encryption versus security debate. The respect for privacy, calling upon technology leaders to urgently and publicly acknowledge the importance of protecting the right to privacy and other human rights in the digital space and take clear company-specific actions to do so. It also touches upon online harassment, particularly faced by vulnerable groups and identities. On content governance and liability frameworks, the roadmap mentions the Christchurch call, and as an example of multi-stakeholder governance, as somebody who has been involved with the Christchurch call for a bit now, and as noted by another member, Dia Khayali, the multi-stakeholder nature of the Christchurch call is promising, but not quite fulfilled. In terms of cooperation, the Christchurch call has a long way of going within, as governments, companies, and international bodies yet do not have a shared definition of either terrorism or extremism. Civil society has been invited onto the table, but has a long way to go before the process can be truly inclusive. Yet, the Christchurch is an important example that must be studied and reviewed, and the roadmap's recognition is an important step in that direction. Finally, on effective architecture for digital cooperation and the various models proposed, we at IGP believe that without recognizing the inherent conflict between the digital world and state sovereignty and the need for transformative multi-stakeholder bottom-up global governance arrangements, the internet will continue to be drawn into geopolitical competition and jurisdictional alignments. I know the role of the IGF will be covered in detail later, but we at IGP believe that the role of the IGF for digital cooperation cannot be overemphasized. IGF exists at the global and the regional level and can be and is a perfect space for these discussions. We believe the IGF should serve as a vehicle to open up these conversations and be used to facilitate multi-stakeholder discussions on the roadmap, not only with the IGF community, but other international government organizations. While the focus, including providing resources to improve IGF, are welcome, we must be wary of proposing top-down redesigns, and any changes to the IGF should be limited to policy dialogue functions. I look forward to engaging with the issues and the discussions as we move forward. I think that's it for now.
Thanks very much, Georgie. And we are running out of time. We still have Jovan. Jovan, I'm going to give you the floor, and I know you're always very concise. And then Adam, if you can just read a few comments in the chat for us. But while you prepare that, Jovan, you have the floor.
But Henriette, I don't need to speak so many speaking commitments. It's fine if you just move to Adam and we conclude the session.
We still have two more speakers, so I am going to. Maybe you can. Some words of wisdom.
I'll be very telegraphic. IGF has to prove itself. It was born as a compromise, and throughout its history, it was shaped by this compromise. The world has changed, especially, that's what we know, especially during COVID crisis, governments are back. They are not anymore bashed. They are playing important role. They have to deliver on social contract to citizens to protect our health, to fight the COVID, to fight now climate change. And digital is not different. Therefore, governments will have a new role and new importance, because we realize that without government, you cannot solve certain problems. The whole geometry of the digital policy space, global policy space, is shaping very fast. We have to move beyond the flosculas and even the words that sentences that we've been using for almost now 15 years to really clarity talk. And clarity talk means that stakeholders should work together, but they should work also, in that famous sentence, in their respective roles and responsibilities. Governments have to deliver on the basic social contract, on their obligation to protect our security, to enable our protection of human rights and human dignity, and to help us to realize our potentials, digital, creative, spiritual, economic. This is very basic. And I think we have to cut through the rhetorical noise and to get back to basics. In this context, IGF can find a space. It has a mandate in the Article 72 in Tunis agenda. There is a need to have a digital for humanity. I wish that Christchurch call or latest ransomware initiative by the US government or some Schengen cooperation country initiatives landed somehow into this renewed IGF, where everybody will feel comfortable, will have a room in that digital home to discuss without any imposition, but in a wider, transparent and inclusive context. That was the spirit how the panel drafted the idea of IGF Plus, and I'm preparing paper with some background notes. That was the idea how to make a relevance of the IGF through the high-level track to get it visibility. When I was in the panel, I used to go to the places and people were basically either they didn't hear of the IGF or they were basically indifferent. This is reality, and since we have around the table here, online table, IGF community, we have to be frank, honest towards ourselves, towards different stakeholder communities, and towards our duty to contribute to the public cause and public good. And this is very important. Inclusion is very weak, even if it is a formal inclusion, substantive inclusion, representing interest or pushing the agenda is not often very active. Therefore, a lot of work to be done. All ingredients are there. Now it's up to the, I would say mainly UN Secretary General and the UN to help us to prepare this new and the better dish, which will build on the core values of the IGF since Tunis: inclusion, multi-stakeholder involvement, action-oriented activities, and more relevance towards more tangible outcomes of the IGF. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Jovan. And I think, yes, and inclusion is a challenge for the IGF. It's a challenge for the roadmap implementation process. And I think, as Shauna Chokra said, that if we really want to address inclusion, we have to confront exclusion. But now to comment on the way forward and the role the IGF can and should play in advancing inclusive internet governance and digital cooperation. Let's hear from Fiona Alexander first, and then Paula Martins. Fiona was a member of the MAG. She was with the NTIA of the US government, has extensive experience of the IGF process, but also through stewarding the IANA transition of working inside that whole process, which has its own power and participation dynamics. Fiona, what is your vision and what do you think can be done concretely for the IGF?
Hello, Henriette. Thank you very much. And hello to everyone. It's nice to see people on screen or at least see names. It's been quite a while since I think many of us have been together, and I look forward to doing that again soonish. So I've just been listening to the conversations today and then all the comments and, rereading all the documents and a lot of stuff sounds familiar to me from many years back. And there are some new things happening. But I'll just start off with my big picture thinking on this, which is the IGF is like the internet itself. It's ever evolving, it's ever adapting and ever improving. But that only happens if you remain true to the core design principles. It has to be open, it has to be inclusive, has to be transparent, bottom up, and it has to be iterative. And this last point about being iterative, I think, is important and is lost, especially in today's world where things happen so quickly for us. It was interesting to me that we're talking about the UN Secretary General and the roadmap and the importance of meaningful connectivity. And I'll just point out to everyone on this session, this predates my time. I was in high school at this point, but the UN first took up the idea of connectivity in 1982 with the Maitland Commission report and something called the missing link. And so that means we've been working on meaningful connectivity in the UN system for 39 years now, right? So nothing happens quickly and there's no simple solution to these things. And I think as technology has evolved and the internet's become so pervasive in our life, it's become even more complicated. So again, this idea of iterative processes and always talking about things and moving forward slowly, I think is a hallmark of this space and one that we tend to forget when we're looking for quick solutions, which politically often is what we're looking for. So I just wanted to talk a little bit, and I'll be brief, I know, given our time constraints here, about my experience with the IGF itself. And I sort of look at the IGF in these 5-year buckets. So, as has been discussed, the IGF came out of the WSIS process. It was a compromise. The US government was very much involved in the creation of this compromise, given the role of not just the US government, but particularly my office at the time's role with the domain name system. So I'm familiar at many levels about how this all came to be. And so the first 5 years of the WSIS process, I think, really was taking up the concern and the continuing challenges related to the domain name system and the US government's unique role at the time. And I think it's not stated enough and probably not clearly enough that the evolution of the US government's role and relationship and the next phase we went to from the MOU to this affirmation of commitments clearly came from the discussions at the IGF. So without 5 years of conversations at the IGF and us hearing at that time at NTIA what people were thinking and seeing, we would not have moved from our oversight role through the MOU to this affirmation, where it was much more of a shared oversight structure with the global community. In addition to those topics kind of preemanating from those 5 years, you have connectivity, you have privacy, you have security. So the IGF always adapting. The next 5 years that I look at, 2018 to 2023, you're still looking at domain name issues, and the IANA function stewardship transition becomes front and center. And again, the decisions that we made in the US government, in particular at NTIA, were very much tied to the conversations that we heard and participated in and listened to in those 5 years of the IGF. So I continue to say clearly that the stewardship of the US government's role and the ANA functions transition and the entire evolution of ICANN is a direct output of the IGF. There's nowhere that is captured as an IGF output, but it is definitely something that influenced our choices and what we were doing and in the ICANN community. But in the second 5-year process, you also focus on privacy and surveillance and other things. This third 5-year process, which I think 2018, 2023, where we currently are, you still see domain name issues, but we're focused on issues of universal acceptance and DNS security, issues of that. We're definitely picking up the issues of content moderation and continued privacy conversations because they dominate today's conversations. And as we've all discovered in this era of COVID, the idea of meaningful connectivity really becomes important. So again, I continue to believe that the IGF can have a very big role. I'm a little skeptical of a top-down process driven directly out of New York via the Secretary General, just based on my own experiences. You really have to, get everyone to be involved. Things don't move if people don't feel like they're part of it. And that is the beauty of the IGF. Everyone can be a part of the process and everyone can shape the process and shape the outcomes. Whereas as a more top-down New York-based focused process, I think leaves people out inadvertently just by the rules of the road and the way that New York works. No matter how inclusive the Secretary General wants to be, there are rules and norms around that system that make it harder for people to participate. So I would just say that I think the roadmap and what's laid out for digital cooperation, I think is a great step forward and could be. I see the IGF as being able to adapt and evolve and take on these issues. You know, when the IGF first happened in Greece, you know, there weren't tons of people there. It's now lots of people show up. The issue of, or the creation of a dynamic coalition happened in Athens, literally because someone wanted to create a follow-on process. It was organic. You now have 20 dynamic coalitions. You have 32 best practice forums. You have the policy networks that Ben talked about before. We have 140 national and regional IGFs that have sprung up around the world, not because anyone in the UN system told people to do it. They saw value and they did it. So again, this idea of a bottom-up construct, I think, is going to be important to solving our problems going forward. And I'll just end with, you know, regardless of the way the community goes forward and how we make choices collectively and individually to tackle these issues, the IGF itself and the roadmap hopefully come together. Nothing gets solved without sustainable resources and commitment and political will of all, not just governments, but all stakeholders. I think we have to be realistic here. Again, there are no quick fixes to these problems. And I give, again, the example of connectivity in the Maitland Commission from 1982 to now, when we're still talking about meaningful connectivity. So it's important that we engage, we participate, and things only change if you show up and make it work. And I think the beauty of the IGF is that it gives you that opportunity. So I'll end with that.
Thanks very much, Fiona. And I am going to come back to Adam, who will read to us what's been said in the chat. Very dynamic interaction. I see, Jyoti, your question about the IGF. Why should the IGF make space, or why should other forums make space for the IGF Plus? And perhaps that's not the question. Perhaps it's really the IGF being the place where other forums can come to connect with one another. But let's give the floor now to Paula Martens, who is with the Association for Progressive Communications, but has been active in the IGF and in the Net Mondiale process and in intergovernmental processes through all her human rights work. Paula, what is your perspective on the IGF and digital cooperation going forward? Particularly, I think, in the light of this powerful vision that we have in the common agenda, which Maria Paz outlined in the beginning.
Thank you, Henriette, and thank you to the organizers of this session for the invitation. It's really a privilege to participate in this conversation and set the scenes to the further conversations that we'll have in December. And I'll start like Maria Paz started, with the obvious, because this past 2 years really made even more evident how the internet is spreading and touching upon several areas of our private and public lives. However, we all know that neither the benefits of digitalization nor its risks and the negative impacts that come with it are equally distributed. The internet, we see it really as a global public resource. The challenges are global, and in order to take the best out of its potential for social and economic development and as an enabler of human rights, we need to approach it really through the lens of global digital cooperation. And the aim of such cooperation should be to improve and democratize the internet, including its governance. For that, at the global level, we need both multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism, and we really see these two as reinforcing models. But of course, this is not a new discussion. WSIS has spelled out 15 years ago the principles for this cooperation, and stated that multi-stakeholder participation should be people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented. And it also set a space where this cooperation could take place, and that place is the IGF. So of course, we're not living in the same political and technological context in which we were living in 2003 in Geneva or 2005 in Tunis. But that said, we really should acknowledge the road traveled, let's say, and take stock of what has been achieved, and then build from there. And so if we say that digital cooperation has to be accelerated today, the IGF should really serve as a key piece. of the UN system, the internet governance and digital cooperation ecosystems, and be seen as a platform for identifying the viable ways to shape, to sustain, and to really strengthen this digital cooperation. With that in mind, we really were pleased to see that the roadmap on digital cooperation referred to the goal of making the IGF more responsive and more relevant to current digital issues. We see that as a recognition of the role that the IGF should have in the digital cooperation architecture. And that said, of course, reforms are needed. We understand that, but we believe that these reforms should be taken with the view of strengthening the IGF and maintaining its bottom-up nature that was already discussed here today, while at the same time improving impact and improving effectiveness. We believe the IGF has the potential to establish a more accountable, more inclusive and participatory global digital cooperation among all stakeholders, building on what we see as its historical strengths and achievements. And that is like fostering knowledge exchange, policy discussions, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and the sharing of best practices related to digital issues in general. But going back a little bit in relation to the strengthening, so there are some key elements that we see that should be there in this process of strengthening the IGF. Further horizontal linkages between the global IGF and the national and regional initiatives, further linkages between the different pieces of the intersectional work, a more targeted and focused programming, reinforced synergies between the IGF and decision-making bodies. And of course, nothing of that is new. It's in the IGF Plus, it's even before that in documents that have been for a while discussing the strengthening of the IGF. And here I would mention the very important work underway by the working group on strategy, strengthening in strategy of the MAG, that has been really going back, taking stock of all these recommendations, trying to look at progress made and actions moving forward. So there's a lot there, and they have produced a number of documents that would serve as the basis, the foundation to continue to discuss these improvements. But we believe that to deliver these improvements, we need strengthened leadership. And this strengthened leadership needs to come to the extent it really strengthens and in no way, again, undermines the IGF structure and the IGF community. And that includes the MAG. We see the MAG as a representative body that has played a central role in the consolidation of the IGF, but it very much focuses on programmatic tasks. So we think that an empowered executive body that could do those functions, like could build on a stronger thematic focus during the sessions, enhance intersessional work, sending clear messages to inform and feed other internet policy and internet governance processes, that would be a very important development. And we believe it would also help to raise the visibility of the IGF. We believe that there's no need for a new structure to be created, especially outside the IGF architecture, and no external body or entity should shape the IGF, its processes and procedures. Any body to be created should be really structured as peer and complementary to the MAG, and should not take decisions on behalf, let's say, of the IGF community. We also, and I'll be moving, closing now here. Give me just one more minute. We really believe the Tunis agenda continues to determine the boundaries of the IGF mandate. And I'll quickly just mention, like, if we're talking about improvements, I think it's important to talk about the process for these improvements to take place. And it has been mentioned here already, the issue of participation, of transparency. These are key features if we want to build the trust, the legitimate, impactful, sustainable changes that we seek. But of course, we also need to recognize, as Fiona was saying, that lack of resources and lack of commitment have been the main challenges to the IGF. So if we want change, we need to address those weaknesses to begin with. really concluding now, but also linking all this discussion to the WSIS plus 20 process that was briefly commented in the session today. We really need to understand that we are in an important moment of recommitting to the principles set in the WSIS declaration, but also taking account of the immense progress that digital technologies have had in recent years. And that calls for a new vision, for a new plan to accelerate implementation. And we believe that the roadmap, the Tech Envoy, the upcoming Digital Compact, and other initiatives within this framework should really be welcomed as bringing new energy and commitment to the WSIS agenda, and not be taken as separate new processes. And I'll stop there. Yes,
thanks very much, Paula, and I'm sorry if I was being impatient. And thanks everyone for bearing with us. So now I'm going to ask Adam Peake to go through some key points in the chat. And while Adam is doing it, we don't have much time, but I want to give any of the speakers, because we have such an amazing group of speakers, a chance to make a soundbite closing remark after Adam has done a summary of the chat. So start thinking about it, and you have to keep it short. And if you want to speak, you have to put up your hand. Adam, over to you.
Thanks, Henriette. So, yeah, where can we begin? There's been a very busy amount of chatting and typing. So, yeah, the first thing I picked up, because it's of great interest to me, this area, is Amir talking about, can we suggest a rules-based environment for the development of internet governance and cyberspace decision-making? And he suggested the International Civil Aviation Organization. And I was a reply from Chris Buckridge suggesting that, yes, we definitely need very tight and locked control over the aviation system, but would those structures be appropriate for the internet and the development of systems that have very different and open types of ways of working? So we're always thinking about new mechanisms to do this, and thanks for Amir for bringing it up, and Chris's reply. Matthew Roberts talking about the need for SDGs to access information, connecting the unconnected, and the IGF roadmap. Do least developing countries really have access to this information? Are they aware of it? And I think that went to Sean and Jyoti's point, really, and in the chat, Ping responded to Sean about the least developing countries, about it being a key area for the Tech Envoy's work, for the work of the UNSG generally, and the upcoming least developing country, was it +5 summit next year. So within this context, they see the roadmap and an evolving process to make this all happen. Very important, it goes to a couple of issues. Mark reminded us as we're thinking about how all these, how the cooperation processes continue, then don't forget the national and regional IGFs. And Fiona mentioned this. There are now more than 140 of these. And I think the first one was probably in 2008. So we've seen a massive evolution of people holding discussions at the national and regional level, having inputs not only to the global IGF process, but into their national and regional processes. So we're not just talking about keeping this dialogue within the talk shop that people have mentioned of the IGF. They're actually taking issues into national processes, regional processes. And I think that goes to Jyoti's comment in the chat, which is about hearing more about incentives to improve participation. And why should others listen to an IGF plus? And perhaps tying that to the comment that we saw about NRIs, perhaps the richness that we're seeing in the whole of the IGF as a whole, the NRI is bringing this extra richness, gives us something around that. And lastly, and sorry, I'm struggling with the chat here, but Kapil mentioned that talking about responsible behavior in cyberspace and internet governance, particularly balancing privacy and security for the next tranche, the next billions of users. And I think that really takes us on to the next session, Henriette. So we've got 20 minutes until trust, security, and stability session begins, the prep session for that issue area. And of course, rather than just trusting me, you can save the chat. You'll see 3 little dots at the bottom of the chat window, and that will allow you to save the chat as a text. And of course, if you open the transcript window, you can also save the transcript of the session, although the transcript will be made available anyway on the links that you'll see on the preparatory session page.
Thanks so much, Adam. And thanks, everyone. Fiona, I see Fiona as the only one of our speakers who want to share a closing thought. Fiona, let's hear from you.
Sure. I just wanted to reiterate, there aren't any quick fixes for these issues for internet governance, for digital cooperation. Routine and regular inclusive engagement is needed. It's the only way you're going to get to problem solving. And the IGF is the perfect vehicle for that. So you have to make the IGF what you want it to be. But again, this isn't going to happen overnight, and you have to show up and participate and work in the system.
Thanks very much, Fiona. And everyone, this has been a really rich session. It's just what we need as we go into the IGF. Sorry, who is that?
That's
Sean,
me.
is that you? Go ahead.
I couldn't
quickly
find the right symbol, but I wanted to throw something in there. I think that multilateralism and multi-stakeholder engagement are sometimes looked at as if they're opposites, or as if you kind of have to choose between one or the other. In fact, they're chalk and cheese in many ways. I mean, multilateralism is fundamentally, it's a legitimate system, but it's as flawed as the governments that are involved. That's the fact. But it has fundamental legitimacy to it. Multilateralism, on the other hand, is a highly malleable approach that each party, depending on their power, can shape to what they need. So we really have to talk about them in different and more open and truthful categories, I think. That's all.
Thanks very much, Sean. And in fact, I was going to highlight that. I think it takes time. We've learned that it takes time. It also takes talking. I think Ben and Fiona both highlighted the value of the IGF as a space for talking, but it also doesn't take just the IGF. We need multiple spaces. We need different types of process. What matters is that we confront power, we confront exclusion, and otherwise we won't be able to be inclusive. And inclusion is not about rhetoric. It's actually about changing how governance happens. It also takes resources, and it takes a community and networks, horizontal linkages through the NRI network, but also vertical linkages with the legitimate, if flawed, system of national government, regional and global intergovernmental spaces. But I think finally, I just want to say it also takes vision. It takes values. We want to know what we want global digital cooperation to achieve, what we want the internet to contribute. And I think we have that. And I think we have the common agenda. We have the WSIS, we have the common agenda, we have emerging values and goals and processes. We also have Net Mondial for those of us who were part of that. So yes, let's not start the process from scratch. Let's not reinvent the wheel, but let's continue to try and just be more effective and address what the real problems in the world are, which are beyond digital cooperation and the internet. Thanks enormously, everyone. Thanks to the MAG members who pulled the session together. They are fantastic. Suki had to leave early, but thanks so much, everyone. Thanks the Secretariat and the speakers, and we'll see you in Katowice, online or in person.
And in the next session. Thank you, everyone.
And in the next session on trust and security, starting in, I can't count, in 18 minutes.
18.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.